Hi there, this is Felicias Journey from Felicias Journey Films, and welcome to another episode of the alphabet of my favourite films. And today's letter is the letter F. Again, for those of you who don't know, this is essentially my short list for eventually doing a favourite 150 films. This is just a short list again. I love seeing your lists, so by all means write down your favourite films beginning with the letter F. I'm going to start with Fanny and Alexander by Ingmar Bergman, with the caveat that I haven't seen it for a while. Obviously it's in the big box, which to my shame I haven't actually watched too many of them yet. Fanny Alexander is probably his last great film. People have kind of called it a greatest hits of Bergman, if you will. It's about ghosts and life and death and God and faith and family. It's just a beautiful film. There's kind of the theatrical cut as well as the TV version. Again, I haven't watched it for a while, but obviously once I do my top 150, I will be re-watching the ones that I haven't seen before to make it an accurate list as possible. You will notice there's actually quite a few of these that I don't have on Blu-ray because they're not actually available on Blu-ray. The next one is coming to Blu-ray though. Arrow Academy is releasing this one later in the year, I think maybe November in the UK. And it's The Far Country. It's one of James Stewart's several films with Anthony Mann. Along with The Naked Spur, which I don't believe is available on Blu-ray, Winchester 73, which I have on Blu-ray, and Bend of the River, which I have in a Kino Lorber Region A Blu-ray. The Far Country is a great wee film. James Stewart actually plays a character that's perhaps against type, because he is a guy that is just not interested in being part of the group. He's actually quite gnarly. He's quite argumentative. He kind of follows these group of people up past the snowy wastes, and they want to kind of build a community and build a village, and they always want to enlist his help. And he's just not into that at all. He's actually quite nasty and angry in it. That perhaps doesn't last the whole of the film, but it's a really interesting performance by James Stewart. And it's maybe not the best James Stewart Anthony Mann Western. I think my favourite's probably The Naked Spur. But it's well worth seeing and well worth having. The next one on the list is another Western. It's The Fastest Gun Alive, which I believe isn't available on Blu-ray. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'd be very happy to be wrong if there's Blu-ray releases of these films. This is a Western starring Glenn Ford, who stars as a storekeeper in a quiet town. That dynamic changes when a bunch of bank robbers on the lam turn up, and through accident a child gives away that there may be a really fast gun in town, which happens to be Glenn Ford. So the villains take the town hostage and put them all in the church until Glenn Ford fights the leader of the gang, because he's obsessed with being the fastest gun alive. It's a really... there's not a lot of action in it. It's more a kind of psychological study of Glenn Ford. And again, Glenn Ford might not be the greatest actor in the world, but he really gives a nervy, twitchy performance as a man who's trying to get away from his past, a man who's given up the guns after, they've brought him nothing but trouble. And he really gives an angst-ridden performance until perhaps the inevitable happens. It's one of those westerns that doesn't celebrate the gun and doesn't celebrate the kind of American way of shoot first, ask questions later. It's actually more about the destructive nature of the gun and the destructive nature of violence and being short-tempered. It's just a great wee film. Again, it's one of those films that's perhaps been forgotten about, but it definitely needs a bit more love, and preferably a Blu-ray release. The next film's actually a modern one, and it's Yorgos Lanthimos' last film, The Favourite. I was a little bit wary of The Favourite before I saw it, just because it had gained awards, just because people seemed to like it, whereas Lanthimos' previous films pretty much divide people. You either kind of love his films or you hate his films, and I don't think there's really a middle ground. So I was a bit suspicious about the fact that people seem to love it, and also the fact he didn't write it, which kind of raised red flags as well, because all of his other films he's at least co-written. But watching it, it's an absolute joy. Obviously Lanthimos did have a hand kind of in the script. Again, it's just full of Lanthimosian moments. I think I did a random review of it, and it does remind you of Barry Lyndon, the way it's shot. He also uses fisheye lenses. It's just absolutely ravishingly beautiful. It does remind you, like Barry Lyndon does, of those 16th century paintings. It's got 3 great central performances by Olivia Colman, who won the Oscar, Rachel Weisz, who probably should have won an Oscar, and Emma Stone, as 3 women who are constantly shifting allegiances between each other. And it's really interesting as an audience, because all 3 of them at moments in the film are absolute swine, and then there's moments in the film where you root for them, and then there's moments in the film where you don't root for them. The male characters in the film are just wonderfully buffoonish. Nicholas Hoult gives a fantastic performance. Mark Gatiss is very good in it as well. it's just a wonderful film. Again, it's not for everybody, because Lanthimos films generally aren't for everybody. It's just full of that black, dark comedy of Lanthimos, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So that's the favourite, which is one of my favourites. The next film, again, I think it might be available in Blu-ray, but I haven't picked it up yet, and that's Fearless, if you can see that. This is not the Jet Li film Fearless. This is the Peter Weir film Fearless, with Isabella Rossellini and Jeff Bridges. It's one of Jeff Bridges' greatest performances, but it never gets talked about. I just never see much about Fearless on the interweb or the YouTube at all. It's as if it's always been forgotten about, but it's a great film. It's about a man who survives a plane crash and starts believing that he is indestructible, he can't die. People seem to gravitate towards him as he alienates his family by doing more and more outlandish things. I mean, for me, it's my favourite Peter Weir film. Obviously, Picnic at Hanging Rock and Master and Commander. I do love Master and Commander. Again, it's a film that doesn't get enough love because it's a fantastic film. But Fearless, I mean, it's not an easy watch. You know, there's lots of scenes in survivor groups with relatives of, or a bereavement group with the relatives of the people who died in the plane crash. So it's not particularly an easy film to watch. But it's just, it has a otherworldly feel to it, again, which how Peter Weir managed to do in Picnic at Hanging Rock as well. And it's just wonderfully acted. Isabella Rossellini is fantastic in it. It's made in 1990, so it's almost coming up for 30 years old. That's terrible. Yeah, it's a great film. If you haven't seen it, try and check it out. If you're a Jeff Bridges fan, it's an essential film to watch. Again, he gives a more insular performance than perhaps his more out there performances, but it's just a fantastic film. Next on the list is Felicia's Journey. This is, for me, Atom Egoyan's last great film. It stars Bob Hoskins. It's set in Birmingham in the 1950s. I don't know whether it's based on fact. That might be right, or it might be wrong, or it might be based on Coen Brothers' idea of fact. But it's essentially about this single man who likes to cook. He's the son of a famous cook from the TV, played by Egoyan's wife, Arce Kinajan, who's been in lots of his films. And she was obviously domineering, and he happens to kill young women. And he meets Felicia, who has come to Birmingham from Ireland seeking her boyfriend because she's found out she's pregnant. And Bob Hoskins' character takes her in and leads her on. It's just one of Bob Hoskins' best performances, and again, it's never kind of talked about. Obviously, Long Good Friday and Mona Lisa and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but this one's such an understated, creepy performance by him. The music's beautiful. I think it was Michael Dana again who was Atom Egoyan's kind of regular creator of music, just like Howard Shore was for Cronenberg. The period detail's wonderful. It's a gentle paced film. The struggle within Bob Hoskins is very good. It's exacerbated by not necessarily a Jehovah's Witness, but a kind of religious woman who comes round and keeps asking him, to repent his sins, and the scenes between those two are just fantastic. It's a really underrated film, and again, it really needs a Blu-ray release, but let me know if it actually has one. The next one is a really happy film. It's Le Faux Follet, or The Fire Within, or Will-O-the-Wisp. It's got like 3 different titles, by Louis Malle. This is from 1963, and it stars Maurice Ronay, who of course was in the wonderful Lift to the Scaffold, which I forgot to put in the letter E, because it's also Elevator to the Gallows. So I apologise for that one. I was kicking myself, because I always refer to it as Lift to the Scaffold, even though it's Elevator to the Gallows. Because there's a UK Blu-ray release that's been coming for the last year, and its release date's now January next year, and it calls it Lift to the Scaffold. Lift to the Scaffold, or Lift to the Gallows even. It's very confusing. See how confusing it is? Because when I first saw it, it was Lift to the Scaffold, but obviously the Criterion, it's Elevator to the Gallows, or Escalator pour l'ascenseur. Oh, yeah. Le Faux Follet. It's a really downbeat, wonderful film about a writer who has decided to kill himself. He gives himself 24 hours to kind of change his own mind, and he goes round his friends or the people that he hasn't seen for a while to try and justify not killing himself, to justify continuing with life, which he's just lost all interest in. It's a slow burn, but it is just for people like me who just love grim, downbeat, fatalistic films. It's absolutely wonderful, and it's kind of up to your own viewpoint whether you think he's going to kill himself at the end or he's not. And then when the end happens, how you feel about the subject and what you've seen before will be how you react to the end. It's just a great wee film. The next one is Field of Dreams, which I've loved since I saw it in 1989 on home video. It's a film that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's a film that's not based in reality, but there's something about it that's just quite beautiful. Again, as somebody once said, it's pure Hollywood corn, but when corn works, it's golden. Again, you all know the story of Field of Dreams, about a farmer, played by Kevin Costner, who hears voices and decides to build a baseball field on his farm. It has one of James Earl Jones' best turns in it. It's great support from Amy Madigan and Ray Liotta as Shoeless Joe Jackson, who featured in The Letter E in 8 Men Out. Frank Whaley gives a nice little turn as well. Burt Lancaster in one of his 2 great late career roles, 3 I suppose, Louis Malle's Atlantic City and Local Hero by Bill Forsyth. Burt Lancaster is in it, and it's just absolutely a great performance. Even if you're not a fan of the film, you need to really watch it for Burt Lancaster and James Earl Jones, because they just wipe the floor with everybody else. It's a beautiful film that again is now 30 years old, and it's fantastic. The next one is another personal favourite that maybe nobody else will love. It's Finally Sunday by Francois Truffaut. This is Truffaut's last film, and it's an absolute blast. It stars Fanny Ardant and Jean-Louis Trintignant as amateur sleuths who get involved when the death of somebody close to them happens. The 2 of them get involved in finding out who done it. I'm hopefully going to do a double take video on 2 Fanny Ardant films by Truffaut, so I'll probably talk about it in more detail, but it's just absolutely fantastic. If you haven't seen it, please do, because it's just one of those films that puts a smile on your face. Both leads are fantastic, the story's great, and for a last film, it's just an absolute joy and pleasure, and it might actually be my favourite Truffaut. I know people might scream at me, but I don't really care. Next on the list, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. Again, this has appeared in a random review. Again, I don't think this is going to be in my top 150. This is just the shortlist. It's a really weird little musical from 1953 that sadly was butchered a bit by the studios. The only film that Dr. Seuss was involved with, and similarly, because of the way the studio treated it, the last film Dr. Seuss was ever involved with directly. About a young boy who doesn't like his piano teacher and ends up being whisked away to this fantasy world where Dr. T wants to kidnap all these children to play on this enormous piano he's created. It's just fantastic. Forget Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. This is superior to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I don't know what that says, but 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T is fantastic. There's great songs in it. Looks beautiful. Indicate have done a really good job with the extras. Fantastic. The next film, if any of you are familiar with the channel, you know it's coming. It's Flash Gordon. Simply the greatest comic book film of all time. Better than any Star Wars film combined. Flash Gordon is a feast for the mind and the eyes. What can you say about Flash Gordon? It's Mike Hodges. I would recommend listening to Mike Hodges' commentary. It's fantastic, because he is not a science fiction fan. He really doesn't like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas. And he made this wonderful fantasy film, which is obviously grounded in reality. I mean, performances by Topol. Max von Sydow as Ming the Merciless is just out of this world. The things he does with his eyes and his hands, he's just marvellous in it. Peter Wyngarde as Clytus, the head of Ming's secret police, is just wonderful. He gets all the best one-liners. Richard O'Brien turns up as one of the Arborean tree people. Timothy Dalton, before he was Bond, gives a wonderful performance as Prince Baron. Brian Blessed gives a wonderful, understated, quiet performance as the leader of the Hawkmen, Voltan. Ornella Muti as Ming's daughter had quite an effect on me as a young man, and still does. Melody Anderson as Dale Arden. Sam Jones is wooden and bland as Flash Gordon, but I think that's the idea. When you just have all these crazy characters round about him, the story is compelling. The special effects, the matte work does kind of stand out a bit on Blu-ray. The soundtrack's by Queen. What more could you ask for? It's the definition of a thrill-packed joyride, and it's just absolutely wonderful. And Flash Gordon, as you may guess, will definitely be in my top 150. Spoiler alert. It's wonderful. And anybody who says otherwise is severely lacking in something. Or maybe I'm lacking in something, I don't know. The next on the list, in comparison to Flash Gordon, is maybe a little bit more downbeat. It's Force of Evil. This is a wonderful little film noir starring Jordan Garfield as a lawyer who's involved in numbers rackets for the mob, and they've decided to make their numbers rackets one big thing, so they want to squeeze out and take over all the small little offices, and one of them is run by John Garfield's brother. It's an unusual little film. The script is almost David Mamet before David Mamet, and I don't mean the swearing, because there's obviously no swearing in it. It's the kind of realistic nature of the dialogue, in the sense that people repeat things, people kind of talk gibberish at times, as people are prone to do. As you've watched my videos, you'll know that. It's just an unusual little film. Polonsky, Abraham Polonsky, who was also a writer, directed it, and he would be blacklisted. There's just such a realism to the dialogue, and the situation. It's just a lovely little noir. The compositions are beautiful, and it's just a great wee film. And it's good that Arrow Academy are really good at releasing films like that maybe I haven't heard of before. It's a really nice little noir. Next on the list is kind of a noir, and one of the essential films of the 70s. It's The Friends of Eddie Coyle, with Robert Mitchum, Peter Boyle. It's just directed by Peter Yates. It's one of those films about It's almost Donnie Brasco before Donnie Brasco, in the sense it's about somebody who is in the criminal underworld but is a very small cog. There's bank robberies going on at the same time as Robert Mitchum's trying to get out from going back to prison, and the two kind of stories collide. Everything's understated. It's just such a great film. I'm not really doing it very justice because I don't want to go into too much detail of it. You just need to see it. It's on Masters of Cinema number 121 on Blu-ray. It's also got a Criterion DVD release. The Friends of Eddie Coyle is an ironic title, but it's just one of those quintessential 70s films. It just oozes the 70s. You know, the cities are ugly looking. Even the bits with the trees have got no leaves. Sorry, I digress. It's just such an earthy 70s film, if that makes any sense. And it's just an essential Robert Mitchum performance. Again, this is late in his career. Peter Boyle, as always, is fantastic. It's a fantastic film. Go watch it if you haven't seen it. And lastly, but not leastly, which isn't a word, Abel Ferrara's The Funeral. Obviously I'm biased because it's Christopher Walken in a lead role, which he doesn't get too many of. This was shot pretty much back to back with The Addiction, Ferrara's fantastic vampire film. And this pretty much follows the story of three brothers, Vincent Gallo, Christopher Penn and Christopher Walken, set in the 20s, I want to say 20s, 30s. Not really a spoiler yet, but Vincent Gallo is killed and Christopher Walken is pretty much turning the city upside down to find out who did it. Again, the funeral is Vincent Gallo's funeral, and this thing's told in flashback. We see Vincent Gallo alive and causing trouble. Benicio del Toro gives a nice turn as another gang boss, a rival gang boss. Christopher Walken has some great lines, some great speeches. There's a speech about, why do gangsters, always kill each other? We should be like the Ford Motor Company. We should be taking over the country instead of killing each other. There's a great scene where he brings Benicio del Toro in to see the corpse, because in myth or legend, if the person who kills the corpse comes into the room, the corpse's wounds should bleed. I'll let you find out yourself whether they do or not. The period detail is wonderful. Again, this would have been made on a very, very small budget, but it looks beautiful. The women in it, Annabella Sciorra does her best work in this and The Addiction. Gretchen Moll's good as the kind of outsider who just happened to be Vincent Gallo's girlfriend at the time he was killed, and she doesn't really fit in with the kind of Italian family dynamic. It's a dark film. It's violent in places. Christopher Walken, again, I know I'm biased, but just gives a fantastic performance, and he really gets a good meaty role to get his teeth into. It's a beautiful film, but it's also obviously a terrible film, and kind of what happens to the family and what happens to these characters and what these characters are actually like. Again, Arrow's released The Addiction. Somebody needs to release The Funeral on Blu-ray. I'm not really sure why it's not on Blu-ray, because it's wonderful. It's another one of Abel Ferrara's best films. So with that, might as well end with The Funeral. Thank you very much for watching. Hope it hasn't been too much of an endurance test for you. And hopefully we'll see you for the letter G. But again, please leave your lists in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. And thank you very much for watching. This is Solitary Ronin saying farewell.